The heretic's fork. In the late 15th century, the Spanish Inquisition sought to purify the faith through methods designed not to kill quickly, but to break the mind and spirit first. Among their tools was the heretic's fork, a deceptively simple device that inflicted continuous agony without drawing blood. It consisted of two double-pronged forks attached to a leather strap, one set of sharp prongs pressed upward beneath the chin, while the other pressed downward against the breastbone. The strap fastened tightly around the neck, making removal impossible. A man accused of blasphemy was brought before the inquisitors in a stone chamber lit by torches. His crime was speaking against church doctrine in a public square. The interrogators fitted the device around his neck, adjusting the leather until the four prongs bit into flesh. The metal points did not pierce deeply, but pressed with enough force to prevent any movement of the head. Within the first hour, his neck muscles began to cramp. He could not lower his chin to rest. He could not raise his head to relieve the pressure. Any attempt to speak drove the lower prongs deeper into his chest. Swallowing became painful, then impossible. Saliva pooled in his mouth with nowhere to go. By the second day, he had not slept. Every time exhaustion pulled his head downward, the prongs stabbed harder, jolting him awake. His legs trembled from standing in one position. The muscles in his neck spasmed uncontrollably. Delirium crept in. He tried to scream, but could only produce a wet gurgle as the prongs punctured the soft tissue beneath his tongue. On the third day, infection set in. The 4 puncture wounds turned red, then began to weep pus. Fever consumed him. His body shook violently, but the fork held his head rigid. The inquisitors watched him convulse, waiting for a confession that his ruined throat could no longer speak. He died on the 4th day. Not from the wounds themselves, but from sepsis that spread from the infected punctures into his bloodstream. His body remained standing, held upright by the device until someone finally cut the strap. Scaphism. In 401 BC, King Artaxerxes II of Persia ordered a punishment so horrific it became legendary even in an era accustomed to brutality. The victim was Mithridates, a soldier who had killed the king's brother Cyrus during battle. Rather than grant him a swift execution befitting a warrior, Artaxerxes commanded he suffer scaphism, a method designed to prolong death beyond what seemed humanly possible. Scaphism was rarely used even by Persian standards, reserved for only the most hated enemies of the empire. The execution began with Mithridates being stripped naked. Guards bound him securely between 2 hollowed-out wooden boats of equal size, forming a shell around his body. His head, arms, and legs protruded from holes cut precisely for this purpose. The boats were then sealed together with metal clasps, creating a tight enclosure around his torso. Once secured, executioners force-fed him a mixture of milk and honey until his stomach distended painfully. The same sticky substance was then smeared liberally over his exposed face, hands, and feet. He was placed in a stagnant marsh under the burning Persian sun. Within hours, the mixture on his skin began attracting insects. Flies landed on his face, crawling into his nose, ears, and mouth. He could feel them walking across his eyes. The milk and honey caused violent diarrhea, but unable to move, the waste collected inside the wooden chamber around his body. The fetid matter quickly became a breeding ground for maggots and more flies. By the 2nd day, insects had begun laying eggs in his ears, nostrils, and excrement-soaked wooden tomb. Mithridates remained conscious as his body became a living ecosystem of parasites. His exposed skin, now sunburned and swollen, provided entry points for burrowing insects. Guards continued force-feeding him daily, ensuring he would not die of dehydration or starvation. His lucidity extended his horror. He could feel creatures moving beneath his skin, consuming him from the inside out. Mithridates survived for 17 days before his body finally surrendered. Execution by elephant. In 1305, the Sultan of Delhi, Alauddin Khalji, ordered a public execution that would demonstrate his absolute power. The condemned was a tax collector accused of embezzling from the royal treasury. Execution by elephant was reserved for crimes against the state, a spectacle designed not just to kill but to terrify any who witnessed it. In South and Southeast Asia, these massive animals were seen as extensions of royal authority, instruments of a ruler's will rather than mere beasts. The execution required careful preparation. For weeks before the scheduled death, a specially trained elephant was kept from food and agitated by its handlers. The animal, a male bull in musth, a state of heightened aggression, stood nearly 10 feet tall at the shoulder. Its tusks had been fitted with sharp metal caps designed to pierce human flesh. The creature had been trained through a precise system of rewards to respond to specific commands from its mahout, or handler, who would direct each movement during the execution. On the appointed day, thousands gathered in the public square. The condemned man was brought forward, his hands bound behind his back. He was forced to kneel in the center of the square as the elephant was led in. Witnesses later described the man's terror as he heard the elephant's footsteps approaching from behind, each impact shaking the ground. The mahout gave the first command. The elephant wrapped its trunk around the man's torso, lifting him 6 feet into the air. The crowd fell silent. The mahout's second command came. The elephant did not kill immediately. Instead, it placed one massive foot on the man's leg and slowly applied pressure. Bones cracked audibly. The condemned screamed as his leg was crushed to pulp. The elephant methodically moved to each limb, crushing them one by one while the victim remained conscious, his body producing enough adrenaline to keep him awake through through unimaginable pain. Only after all 4 limbs were destroyed did the Mahout signal for the final command. The elephant positioned its foot over the man's head and pressed down. The rack. In 1534, William Tyndale was imprisoned in the Tower of London. His crime was translating the Bible into English, considered heresy by the Catholic Church. While imprisonment itself was brutal, it was the repeated sessions on the rack that made Tyndale's experience a descent into calculated suffering. The rack was not designed to kill outright, but to break both body and spirit through methodical application of pain beyond human tolerance. It was England's premier instrument of torture during the Tudor period. The device itself was deceptively simple, a rectangular wooden frame with rollers at each end. Guards stripped Tyndale and laid him on his back on the wooden bed. His wrists were secured to one roller, his ankles to the other, using heavy rope or iron shackles that bit into the flesh. The torturer, an experienced man who knew precisely how far a body could be stretched before fatal damage occurred, stood ready at the handle that controlled the mechanism. With each turn of the handle, the rollers rotated in opposite directions, increasing the tension on the victim's body. The first turns produced immediate pain as joints were stretched to their natural limits. Tyndale would have felt his shoulders and hips burn with resistance. The torturer paused, asking for confession. When none came, he turned the handle again. The popping sound that followed was Tyndale's shoulders dislocating. His screams echoed through the stone chamber. Each subsequent turn separated more joints, elbows, knees, then individual finger and toe joints tearing apart. The most excruciating aspect was not just the pain, but Tyndale's complete helplessness as his body was systematically destroyed. Blood vessels burst beneath his skin, creating spreading bruises. Ligaments tore away from bone. The torturer knew exactly how to keep him conscious, occasionally throwing cold water on his face when shock threatened to provide relief through unconsciousness. Between sessions, physicians attended to him, not out of mercy, but to ensure he survived for the next round. For nearly a year, Tyndale endured repeated racking, his body never healing from one session before the next began. His arms remained permanently stretched, several inches longer than natural. Boiling alive. On April 5, 1532, Richard Rose faced the crowd at Smithfield in London. Rose, a cook in the household of Bishop John Fisher, had been accused of poisoning the porridge served in the bishop's kitchen, killing 2 people. King Henry VIII was so outraged that he personally intervened, passing a special act of Parliament declaring poisoning a form of high treason and prescribing boiling alive as its punishment. Rose would be the first to suffer this newly codified torture, a spectacle designed to demonstrate the crown's power. The execution platform had been prepared with methodical care. At its center stood a massive cauldron, large enough to contain a man, filled with water and mounted over a roaring fire. The flames had been burning since dawn, bringing the water to a vigorous boil. Steam rose in clouds, visible to the thousands who had gathered. Rose was led up the steps to the platform, his hands bound tightly behind his back. Guards stripped him naked, exposing him to the jeers of the crowd. The executioner checked the temperature of the liquid with a long wooden pole, nodding to indicate readiness. 4 strong men seized Rose by his arms and legs. As they lifted him, he began struggling violently, suddenly comprehending the full horror of what awaited. The men swung him 3 times to build momentum, then released him feet first into the boiling water. The initial shock sent water splashing over the cauldron's rim, sizzling as it hit the flames below. Rose's legs entered first, the scalding liquid instantly blistering his skin. He screamed with such force that witnesses later claimed they could hear him clearly despite the roar of the crowd. His lower extremities were instantly cooked, the skin sloughing off in sheets to expose raw flesh beneath. Blood vessels burst instantly, creating a crimson tinge in the water. The extreme temperature caused fat beneath the skin to melt and float to the surface. Guards used poles to force him deeper into the cauldron. His internal organs began to cook while his brain remained horrifyingly alert, processing each moment of agony until shock finally rendered him unconscious. The entire process took nearly 15 minutes, with Rose conscious for most of it. His last words, recorded by a witness, were desperate pleas for someone to pull him out and grant him a quicker death. The breaking wheel. In 1348, during the height of the Black Death, Jacques Fournier was dragged to the town square of Avignon, France. Accused of spreading plague by poisoning wells, Fournier faced execution on the breaking wheel, also known as the Catherine Wheel after the martyrdom of St. Catherine. As hysteria over the plague intensified, authorities sought spectacular punishments to appease public fear. The wheel was selected not just to kill but to destroy the body so methodically that it would serve as the ultimate warning to others. The wheel itself was a massive wooden cartwheel, 5 feet in diameter, with heavy wooden spokes radiating from its center. Workers secured it horizontally atop a sturdy wooden scaffold. Fournier was stripped naked and spread at eagle across the wheel. Using thick ropes, executioners bound his arms and legs to the wheel's rim, stretching him into an X shape that exposed the joints and long bones of his limbs. The punishment began with methodical precision. The executioner, a man known for his strength, approached with an iron rod as thick as a man's wrist. He first struck Fournier's right shin between 2 gaps in the supporting frame. The blow shattered both bones with an audible crack. Fournier screamed screamed, his body instinctively trying to curl protectively, but held firm by the bindings. The executioner proceeded systematically, left shin, right forearm, left forearm, allowing several minutes between each strike so the victim would fully experience each new agony before the next began. After breaking the major limbs, the executioner targeted joints, elbows, shoulders, knees, ankles. Each precise blow dislocated and crushed the joint completely. Despite catastrophic injuries, Fournier remained conscious, his nervous system overwhelmed by signals it could not process. Blood pooled beneath the wheel as broken bone fragments pierced through muscle and skin. By tradition, the final mercy was to deliver crushing blows to the chest and abdomen, rupturing vital organs. This coup de grace was deliberately withheld. Instead, the wheel with Fournier still bound to it was hoisted onto a pole in the town square. He survived for 3 more days, exposed to the elements, before death finally came. Lingqi. On April 10, 1905, Wang Wei-qin faced his execution in Beijing, China. He had been convicted of murdering an entire family, a crime deemed so heinous that ordinary execution was considered insufficient punishment. The Qing dynasty court sentenced him to Lingqi, death by 1,000 cuts, one of the last such executions before the practice was officially abolished later that same year. Lingqi was reserved for only the most severe crimes: treason, patricide, or mass murder. It was not merely execution, but the systematic destruction of the body, an act believed to deny the victim proper reincarnation. The execution ground had been prepared before dawn. A wooden frame shaped like a cross stood in the center of a courtyard, surrounded by a crowd of officials and curious onlookers. Wang was brought forward, stripped to the waist, and secured to the frame with leather straps at his wrists, ankles, and torso. The bindings were tight enough to prevent movement, but positioned to allow access to all parts of his body. The executioner approached, carrying a sharp, thin-bladed knife designed specifically for Lingqi. This blade was kept razor sharp, allowing it to slice through skin and muscle with minimal resistance. The procedure followed a prescribed ritual. The executioner began with the peripheral areas of the body, the thighs and outer chest. With surgical precision, he removed small strips of flesh approximately 1 inch wide. Each cut was deliberate, shallow enough to avoid severing major blood vessels that might hasten death. Wang's screams echoed across the courtyard as the first cuts exposed raw tissue to the open air. Officials stood nearby, consulting a scroll that dictated the exact sequence of cuts. The most horrific aspect of Lingqi was not just the pain but the awareness. Wang remained fully conscious as his body was systematically dismembered. The executioner worked methodically toward more sensitive areas: inner thighs, chest, face. Between cuts, attendants applied hot cloths to the wounds, both to stem bleeding and to intensify pain through cauterization. The process was deliberately extended, designed to last for hours. Wang's consciousness was maintained through periodic splashes of cold water to his face. After approximately 300 cuts, the executioner finally delivered the mercy stroke, a knife thrust directly to the heart, ending Wang's torment after nearly 2 hours of systematic mutilation. Rat torture. In 1542, Johann Diaz was imprisoned in the dungeons of the Spanish Inquisition. Accused of heresy for possessing Protestant texts, he had already endured weeks of conventional questioning. When standard methods failed to extract a confession, the inquisitors turned to more creative means of persuasion. Rat torture was rarely documented in official records, but was whispered about among prisoners as the most terrifying fate that could befall those who refused to confess. Unlike many tortures designed for public spectacle, this method was employed in the isolated depths of dungeons where screams would echo unheard. The torture chamber was prepared with clinical efficiency. Guards stripped Diaz and secured him to a heavy wooden table with iron restraints at his wrists, ankles, and neck. The restraints were tightened until they cut into his flesh, ensuring he could not move even a fraction of an inch. His abdomen was exposed, pale skin stretched taut over his ribcage. The torturer approached carrying a metal container resembling a bucket with one open end. Inside, Diaz could hear frantic scratching. A large rat captured from the sewer system beneath the prison and deliberately starved for 3 days. The torturer placed the open end of the container directly on Diaz's bare stomach. The rat immediately began scratching at the soft flesh, its claws leaving thin red welts. A servant brought forward a brazier of glowing coals and placed it atop the closed end of the metal container. As the metal heated, the rat grew increasingly frantic. The animal had only one escape route, through Diaz's body. He felt the creature's first desperate bite tear through his skin. Blood welled around the rat's snout as it chewed more aggressively, driven mad by the intensifying heat above. Diaz remained conscious as the rat burrowed deeper. The animal's instinct for survival overcame any obstacle, gnawing through muscle tissue and eventually reaching the peritoneal cavity. The inquisitors watched impassively as Diaz's screams transformed into gurgles. The rat continued its desperate journey, tearing through internal organs in its panic attempt to escape the heat. The pain was beyond description, not a single overwhelming shock, but a moving epicenter of ikani that traveled through his body as the creature tunneled deeper. After 40 minutes of this progressive horror, the rat reached Diaz's diaphragm, finally causing enough damage to vital systems that his body could no longer maintain consciousness. He died from catastrophic internal bleeding shortly thereafter.